I'm just an ordinary mutant. I don't have any special powers. I just look different.
The X-Men are one of Marvel's premier super teams. They have been for decades. Across different titles and different mediums, team members change, missions change, backstories change, but what remains consistent is the fact that the X-Men are mutants, born different, with abilities that sometimes appear gifts, sometimes curses, and sometimes both at the same time. The other constant is that the most enduring threats these mutants face aren't from space or from other dimensions, but from Earth. These threats come from ordinary humans, many of whom hate and fear the mutant minority. In many of the possible future timelines the X-Men often fight to avert, that hate, that fear has doomed not merely the Earth's mutant population, but its human one too. This month sees the first new X-Men project to come to our screens in a few years, the first mainstream animated one in over a decade. X-Men 97 from Marvel Studios serves as a continuation of the widely beloved 90s animated series, but much of the conversation ahead of this show's release hasn't been on how this familiar world will look 30 years on, or how neato it'll be to hear the returning voice cast step back into their roles. No, much of the conversation has been driven by aggrieved influencers, news sites, and social media users claiming that this Disney reboot will be woke, will make the X-Men woke, that this wasn't the case until now. These claimants have pointed to the seemingly altered design of Rogue and to the pre-release promotional materials that confirmed this revival is going with an explicitly non-binary depiction of the character Morph. Just as many voices have responded in disbelief, claiming themselves that this bout of outrage is patently nonsensical because the X-Men were always woke. So, is this true? What's even being disputed here, and what are the stakes? Well, those questions are what this video intends to settle, or rather, what it intends to finish settling. This is the final installment in a loose triptych of videos, so if you're interested in the Rogue matter specifically, you're best to watch this video first. And if you're interested in who the voices pushing this debate are and why they might be doing so, I'd recommend my last video. Both of these should be linked in the corner now. Neither of those are required viewing for this though. Here, we'll take the Morph discussion as our primary focus and allow it to lead us to those larger questions. Let's get going. Part 1. The Morph Factor. So, Morph is non-binary now, and that clarification led to a lot of pushback. Most of these discussions are framing this as an absolute break. X-Men, the animated show, wasn't woke, and now is, suggesting this Morph stuff shows a clear change from what was to what is. But how accurate is this framing? Sure, historically there isn't a bunch of non-binary representation in Marvel's old cartoons, but how about the comic books? Well, that is a different matter. You could look at a character like Zaven from Runaways or Cloud from Defenders, both of whom switch genders like a CS player with a fancy knife switches weapons. Sorry, that's kind of a niche metaphor, I mean a lot. Or we could just look at Morph. In his role in Exiles, also where that white head look comes from, Morph routinely presents in female forms, and sometimes it's for a gag, sure, but sometimes it's not. We also see in a flashback that Morph wasn't gendered at birth. The Doctor's words were literally, "Congratulations, it's a blob." This stuff is from decades ago, and yes, it is stuff that post-dates animated series Morph, but you know what else came after the 90s show? The Hellfire Gala, the mutant nation of Krakoa, and it seems like X-Men 97's gonna be using those ideas, at least a little. X-Men 97's philosophy isn't let's make the whole production team pretend it is literally 1997, hence the animation, the slight design revamps, right? The philosophy there was reportedly fresh but familiar. And that phrase looks to describe the show's ethos as a whole quite nicely. But even if this, too, is a bridge too far, if you don't like the fresh but familiar approach, if you're determined to hold against this show the fact that it's not trying to be a slavish period piece continuing only those ideas found specifically in or before the 90s cartoon, less revival, more re-animation, well, we can just look to the show itself. A recent Variety article features original showrunner Eric Lewald, yes, one of the guys behind the 90s show, highlighting the continuity between 97 Morph and 90s Morph, saying, he attacks Wolverine, his closest friend, in the most dramatic way by turning into Jean Grey and putting his hand on Wolverine's neck and leaning in for a kiss. That's as non-binary as you can get. It's Morph turning into a woman and coming onto Wolverine to freak him out, he says. It was all there in Morph's character. Now, it bears mentioning that being non-binary and being a shapeshifter willing and able to take on a differently gendered form aren't necessarily the same thing. Indeed, I gather a lot of trans folks take issue with the way the gender-fluid shapeshifter trope assumes a perhaps wrong-headed linkage of gender and sex, and there's another reason that this character type isn't unproblematic. All the characters we've discussed are shapeshifters or aliens or other types of being who have transcended the gender binary for biological or metaphysical reasons, and that's better than nothing, but it probably does send the wrong message if the only figures we see in media eschewing that binary have extra reasons for doing so. Would it not be better if we had some non-binary characters who were just guys? Non-shapeshifter, non-alien guys? On the other hand, though, where would that character be in a revival of the 90s X-Men show? Well, nowhere, really. And there's also the fact that some trans folks do like this character type, enjoy watching the fantasy of switching between different bodies this seamlessly. But whether or not Morph will serve as good rep isn't what's being debated, is it? How a non-binary viewer experiences gender may not line up with the interpretation given here, and whether or not that interpretation will push beyond a potentially suspect trope remains to be seen. But what the Variety article does tell us is that the way X-Men 97 is approaching Morph's non-binary identity has direct precedent in the text of the original show. As I'm putting this video together, only the first 2 episodes have been released, but so far, what we've seen of the character absolutely backs this up. So what exactly are people up in arms about? The culture warriors aren't burning old issues of Exiles. They're not decrying the old show, they're mourning it, even as its creators tell us that New Morph is simply a continuation of Old Morph, whose behavior those culture warriors didn't and don't find alarming. Well, it's the term, isn't it? When you suggest that a shapeshifter, especially one with a habit of casually shifting from a male-presenting form to other ones, is probably going to have a different relationship with their body and the way it's perceived by society than your average Joe, no one bats an eye. But when you describe that relationship as gender and that difference as falling outside of the gender binary, when you say non-binary, everyone loses their minds. Non-binary is one of those scary terms, like critical race theory or DEI, terms that are jargony or specific enough that somebody outside of the know isn't going to be able to instantly grasp their meaning, terms that as a result can be redefined, punched up, and weaponized by conservative media without the general audience knowing. Take this article from Glenn Beck's media network The Blaze, which uses the topic of morph to assert that being non-binary didn't exist as a concept back during the original run of the animated series, and of course to imply through this that morph being made non-binary now either reflects or is part of this new, degenerate, subversive, leftist, gay lifestyle push that the media and the celebrities are all in on that's a threat to the West and to the kids, blah blah blah. The problem is, of course, that the article is wrong. It's almost right, that is, it's almost technically right. Non-binary as a term didn't really enter the lexicon until around the turn of the millennium, but the article doesn't say term, does it? It says concept, and the concept of existing outside the gender binary is one that existed and was discussed in the 90s, albeit with a different vocabulary, with terms such as genderqueer, and is one that's observable far further back, across the centuries and indeed across the world. There's a whole page listing relevant historical examples, which I'll link in the description. It does skew heavier toward recent years, but that's largely because we just have more information on, say, the 70s than we do on the Middle Ages, because, you know, that's how time works. One interesting example is the Public Universal Friend, a genderless evangelist that traveled to the US around the end of the 18th century. Their existence and their eschewal of the gender binary is well documented. And, of course, analogues exist in other societies. Non-adherence to a gender binary is visible, for instance, in various forms across indigenous American cultures, with this habit sometimes grouped together under the umbrella term two-spirit. So regardless of whether a non-binary gender identity is new for Morph or for Marvel, it's not just some new thing either. But again, this stuff isn't yet common knowledge. To the wider public, the term non-binary is still unfamiliar enough to be hijacked, loaded up with moral panic. So when a certain subset of people see the word non-binary used to describe a character in a revived show, especially when that news is communicated to them through The Blaze or one of the other distorting partisan media outlets we discussed in my last video, all those groomer panic alarm bells start ringing, despite the fact that those outlets are repeating lies.
That's Morph. He's back and he's non-binary, because that was a thing in 1997. Remember all the non-existent non-binary people back in 1997?
And openly professing they didn't care before it became the hot button issue.
Changeling, aka Kevin Sidney, which I believe is one of his original names or aliases. Go Google it if you want. I don't care enough to remember because I wasn't a Morph fan. How do you like that?
Despite the fact that not much has changed, despite the fact that what little has changed has textual precedent, and despite the fact that a lot of the people making those changes are the people who made the thing being changed in the first place. Oh, and of course, the fact that there's nothing dangerous or degenerate or groomery or new even about being non-binary. That last bit ought to go without saying, but it's probably worth saying anyway. Despite all that, somehow people are convinced and enraged anyway. They're making the X-Men woke. And if your knowledge of the X-Men goes beyond, say, a few stray memories of a decades-old cartoon, or having half-watched a film or two while you scrolled TikTok, or, I don't know, worked on that woodcutting skill cape, that complaint does come across as a fairly ridiculous one, and it's easy to respond to that with sweeping claims to the contrary. What do you mean? The X-Men were always woke. Those sweeping statements are broadly true, of course, and the commonly cited examples from across X media are certainly valid ones. The fact that Chris Claremont had wanted Mystique to be Nightcrawler's dad, even way back in the day, the "have you tried not being a mutant" scene from X2, the way that first film's villain justifies his bigotry via his religion, the way that same film positions mutants as Jews and immigrants, and yes, let's not forget, the very KK-coded Friends of Humanity group from the animated series itself.
Why do you hate us? What did we ever do to you?
You were born.
It's easy to cite example after example of the franchise or its creatives having made, or in some cases been held back from making, explicitly progressive points and gestures, because it's happened a lot. But sometimes this impulse leaves just a little to be desired. Don't get me wrong, responses like this are, right, but they're not always the most useful as arguments. And that's fine. Most people responding to X-Men went woke claims aren't doing so in an attempt to reach out, meet their opponent where they're at, and walk them through why they're wrong, and nor should they be. It's not your responsibility to rehabilitate the people yelling at you. Hell, that's what I'm doing most of the time in replies too. If I've just been editing a video for 12 hours straight, I open YouTube Studio and I see someone's thrown an amount of batshit nonsense my way that'd take more than a few minutes to unravel, I'm not going to be able to do that, and I'm not going to want to. I'll probably just politely inform them that their brain is made of soup and move on. But since I'm intending this video to be somewhat definitive, I think it's worth trying to take a fuller view of the issue. So let's get on to part 2. Were the X-Men always woke? Let us imagine a figure I'll call the skeptical fan. He is an X-Men fan, but he's the type of X-Men fan that's more interested in the details than the subtext. He can tell you which issue Kitty Pryde showed up in at the drop of a hat, Uncanny X-Men 129 for the record, but he's not so interested in what her explicit textual Jewishness means for the series and for the medium. He can tell you that in 2019's Marauders series, after having been rejected by the mutant nation of Krakoa, Kitty started going by the name Kate, the same name her weary, battered future self had used in Days of Future Past, in the timeline where the Sentinels had won. But the trivia factor there is more interesting to him than asking what it means. Is it about rejection, failure, or is it about growth? Anyway, let's say this bloke opens up Twitter one February morning and sees all that discourse kicking off around Rogue and around Morph. Now, he's seen enough of the animated show to realize Rogue was only this caked up in the one shot people are circulating, so non-issue there. And he sees this Morph and thinks, yeah, that's Exile's Morph, sure. But they're non-binary? Well, Morph always was a shapeshifter. Sure, Morph could always change forms, could appear female, but Morph did use male pronouns, and now they're changing that? Maybe the skeptical fan has interacted with non-binary folks before, understands what that means, but maybe he hasn't. Maybe this remains a little opaque to him. And then he sees what appear to be accurate statements. Morph was a man, this is new, this is Disney's reboot adding or inserting queerness into what was a kid's cartoon, being responded to derisively. People are saying, making these points was always the purpose of the X-Men. The X-Men were always woke. If you don't see this, you're the Friends of Humanity. And that confuses the skeptical fan a little. Because he knows that whole Magneto was intended to be Malcolm X, Professor X as MLK thing is an urban myth created in retrospect. He knows, like we discussed a little last video, that the team wasn't created as an allegory for the persecution of minority groups. The characters and settings Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created with the X-Men ended up providing a brilliant canvas for exploring ideas like that, and soon enough creators would explore that intentionally, even in that original 60s run. But to say this was always the idea behind the X-Men isn't 100% accurate, and the skeptical fans watched enough Stan Lee clips on YouTube to know this. He's not ignorant enough to deny that the capacity for this kind of metaphor with the X-Men goes back a long way, but he also sees that it wasn't very often pushed right to the foreground, made directly textual, that for most of X history, the mutant metaphor operated primarily on vibes, and that even when that pushing to the foreground happened, the results were often limited. And that isn't wrong. To quote Leon Miller, looking back on the X-Men animated show for The Escapist, handed a laundry list of laughably strict guidelines by the censors, series creators Eric Lewald, Sidney Iwanta, and Mark Eden still delivered an X-Men show that reflected the original Marvel comic books' themes of discrimination and prejudice, but because of those strict guidelines, the storytelling comes across as painfully diluted. X-Men the Animated Series is a show that quite literally doesn't have the vocabulary to properly express its core ideas. It's kinda hard to unpack societal ills when you can't even use words like kill or die. The results were sometimes limited in another sense too. Douglas Wolk, in his book All of the Marvels, writes, "The clunkiest X-Men storylines are often the ones that try to draw direct connections to real-world issues, like a 1990 sequence involving a mutant-killing AIDS stand-in called the Legacy Virus." It's also true, of course, that at its heart, the mutant metaphor isn't a perfect fit for the racial, queer, or disability issues it's most often linked with. Comparing fear of mutants or registration or cure attempts to real-world minorities too closely ignores the fact that mutants can legitimately pose a danger to life even when they don't intend to. So are people overstating things? Is it revisionism to say this, that the X-Men were always woke historically? Sure, there are those examples we gave a moment ago, but those only prove that X-Men projects have made points in the past, not that to be an X-Men project is to make those points intrinsically. And no doubt many would disagree, stuff like the Friends of Humanity is woke. Even if the Friends are trying to evoke groups like the Nazis or the KKK, is criticizing them woke? Isn't it just a sensible, uncontroversial stance? Were the X-Men always woke? Well, okay, part of the confusion here comes from the words we're using. I think it's fair to assume exasperated people replying with some variation of "the X-Men were always woke, this is a nothing burger, pick up a comic book" are aware of much of the above, that there is some amount of crosstalk and hyperbole going on, facilitated by social media character limits and by the dunk incentive. When someone says the intention behind the X-Men was always to explore bigotry, they don't necessarily mean this was true literally from minute one, but that might not be immediately apparent to someone like our skeptical fan. And there's a bit more crosstalk going on too. Not with the idea that the X-Men were always woke, but with the idea that the X-Men were always woke. So let's talk about that word. First, I'll just clarify that if you think it means you've just woken up from a delightful sleep, if you're just a little guy who's always napping and that's where your mind went, you are a bit off there. But hey, that being said, you could probably do with hearing about this video's sponsor, Manta Sleep. Manta make a whole range of sleep masks that range from chic to high-tech, and all of them are designed to help you get to sleep quickly and comfortably. I'm a side sleeper, so Manta sent me one of their pro models, and I love it. It's perfect for me, with instant blackout and adjustable eye cups, so I can honk me all night long, or all afternoon long. Manta Sleep are proudly pro-nap. There's only one real woke threat out there, and that's insomnia. Do you get it? Check them out and use my code PILLAR for 10% off at checkout. But yeah, back to X-Men discourse, this woke doesn't mean that you've just risen from a delightful nap, so what does it mean? I've talked about this in more depth in these videos, which I'll link below, so we'll try to keep this brief, but woke isn't really one word, in that the way the word's been used has changed significantly over the years, and we can divide this shift roughly into 3 phases. The term originated in African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, and being woke meant being aware, meant you'd awoken to the wide systemic inequalities that near invisibly influenced your lived experience as a minority, the things the majority of society weren't yet aware of or interested by. Initially, that is, from the 60s until maybe 7 or 8 years ago, most people using the word had this sense firmly in mind. A few years back, after the term had entered the mainstream, it began to be used ironically too, by figures on the right and left alike, criticizing shallow, corporate acts of performative inclusion. And then, partially because some of the right-wingers using the term had trouble differentiating performative inclusion from authentic sentiment, partially because some of them were operating with a mindset which didn't consider that to be a distinction worth making, and partially because some of them stood to gain personally or politically from muddying that water, treating all inclusion as pandering, i.e. casting criticism of historical racists and bigots as merely smug grandstanding. Woke's third and currently dominant usage emerged. Woke as a catch-all term for modern progressivism, modern progressive ideas, or for arguably progressive modern artifacts, laden with vague Great Replacement connotations. You will find many people who claim to have more specific definitions of this third wave wokeness. There will doubtless be some of them down there in the comments already, but they're all more than happy to discuss, and more often to criticize, wokeness with other people whose specific definitions differ or do not exist. And so the only workable definition for wokeness in this sense is a broad and malleable one. To be disabled, non-white or queer or an anti-fascist or a critic of dominant power structures and so on is to be woke. And to include any of these qualities in a work in a way that doesn't explicitly apologize for their presence is to make something woke. Any one of an ever-expanding cloud of attributes and sentiments is enough to designate a person or thing woke, and that mere process of designation marks the person or thing as a threat, part of a larger nebulously defined process of cultural replacement or subversion, and as a target for the braying masses of sympathetic pundits, creators, and audience members to decry, harass, and destroy, both dangerously strong and hideously weak. Again, we've covered this before. So bringing it back to the X-Men, 2 people can argue over whether or not the X-Men have always been woke, and mean different things. One can be intending to say the X-Men has always authentically reflected the minority experience and explored the inequalities and hardships faced by those outside society's norms, and the other can intend to say the X-Men hasn't always explicitly included figures who embody currently controversial progressive attributes, and they might not even realize they're arguing different points. So, looking at the rebuttal that the X-Men were always woke, our skeptical fan might see absolute continuity being argued for, when the fact is that something has changed. Morph wasn't explicitly non-binary, and now they are. They might see claims being made about authorial intention that aren't technically right. And they might see the people making those claims asserting that the people disagreeing are just like the Friends of Humanity, are a hate mob. Well, that isn't right. They're not a bigot. They're just not getting on board with technically incorrect claims. And if that makes the progressives online lump them in with the fictional hate group, well, maybe they've lumped some other people in wrongly too. Maybe it's worth seeing what those others are saying, and maybe some of the lines about leftists rewriting history or ignoring reality start to sound a bit more plausible. What do you know, our once halfway reasonable fan has well and truly entered the pipeline. In 6 months' time, he's going to be one of those guys that posts cringe while convinced of his own rationality, and in a couple of years, he's going to be a full-blown DEIESG wackadoodle. And maybe this could have been avoided with a little more specificity. Specificity in moments of discourse flare-up like this is valuable. Again, though, it takes a while and it takes effort to be specific and to be thorough. And that means it's kind of a luxury, one we can't always afford. But that's what a video like this is for. I've put weeks into this so you can watch it in minutes and share it in seconds. So let's nail down what we mean when we say the X-Men were always woke for good. Part 3. The X-Men were always woke. The X-Men were always woke in that original sense, responsive to the dynamics of marginalization. Again, perhaps not intentionally from minute one, but unintentionally from minute one, or rather issue one. Mutants as minority is textual from the beginning, and intentionally from not long after. And just as important, the franchise is doubling down on this minority dynamic with the new giant-sized characters, and Claremont's subsequent decade plus on the book came hand in hand with the X-Men's journey from cancelled C-listers to one of the best-selling American comic book series of the 20th century. That meteoric rise was due in part to the quality of Claremont's writing and the talent of the artists he was working with, but what Claremont wrote, what those artists inked and colored, were stories about identity, exclusion, and the social material systems that limit or define our experiences. To again quote Douglas Wolk, Claremont and Byrne figured out how to use the protean metaphor for oppression and marginalization that was embedded in X-Men's premise, and turned it into rocket fuel for their stories. For Ramzi Fawaz, writing in his book The New Mutants, Superheroes and the Radical Imagination of American Comics, right back to the new giant-sized characters' introductory sequences, the new X-Men of the 70s visually linked the popular fantasy of mutation to concrete differences grounded in histories of race hatred, Cold War political oppression, and Western imperialism. Across different decades, across different continuities and different mediums, the identities of our mutants change, the real-world struggles they evoke most clearly shift, the specific problems they're up against fluctuate, but the heart is consistently this woke, this aware dynamic. In Wolk's words, mutants as the despised and oppressed other. And that isn't to say that every issue or episode of X Media has something tangible to offer here, just that you'd be hard-pressed indeed to find a piece of X Media that can't be read through the lens of marginalization, and that many of the most beloved, memorable, or influential stories are centered around otherness. This is seen maybe most clearly in the legacies of Dark Phoenix and Days of Future Past, the stories Wolk calls the two X-Men masterplots. As while both were big events in their own right, they also provided two adaptable blueprints to be traced and traced again over the years. Wolk argues so many key X stories like Here Comes Tomorrow, Age of Apocalypse, House of M, and many more are at heart retellings of these master plots. Those two stories formed this skeleton because of their enduring potential, the way they ask the questions this world presents. As Wolk explains, Dark Phoenix says, "This world is terrible to my people. What might happen if it pushed one of us too far?" Days of Future Past says, "This world is terrible to my people. What might we have to do or sacrifice to make it right?" Those are questions that haven't gone away in the past 40 years, and it's not a flaw in X-Men that it continues to find new ways to ask them. That's what sets it apart, and its difference is its gift. And this aware core persists across X Media. I quoted an escapist article earlier which suggested that projects like the animated show toned this side of things down, didn't have the vocabulary to express these ideas, and I don't disagree entirely, but I do think viewpoints like that don't give the show enough credit. You don't need to say kill to make a clear point.
Why has it gotten worse?
When we saved President Kelly's life last year, he learned that not all mutants were evil. Now his followers feel betrayed. So often in our history, unhappy, misguided people have created scapegoats, blaming those that are different for the problems in their own lives.
So in this first sense, yes, the X-Men are and have consistently been woke, but that's not the end of it. What about the other dominant conception of wokeness? Woke as controversially progressive, therefore morally suspect artifact. Well, you might think it's impossible to assert continuity here to reclaim X-Men as always woke in this sense, since this sense is so shakily defined and so tied to our current cultural moment, but I'm not sure. Sticking with Wolk for a moment, an earlier passage from All of the Marvels is telling here. Discussing the variable applicability of the mutant metaphor, Wolk writes, "Mutants are sort of every marginalized group, but they're also none of them, or at least not one that exists in the real world." Continuing that in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, when the heroes of popular culture were even more monotonously straight, white, able-bodied American cis male types than they are now, X-Men declared there were other possibilities. And that observation points to a simple truth. Those progressive sentiments we now take for granted in the history of the X-Men, the intersectionality of classic teams, Clement's empowered female heroes, and the way so many stories reject the dehumanization of those outside dominant social norms, those only seem uncontroversial now because they happened so long ago. Those pages have survived, have been archived in our culture and our memories, isolated from the cultural milieu of their production and reception. It's true that X projects of the past didn't always include the specific identities and positions reactionaries and conservatives reject today, but they did very often operate in ways reactionaries and conservatives of the past rejected then. And while there were no forum posts or Twitter threads back in the 80s I could pull up to demonstrate the way now classic characters and stories were received back in the day, you know what did exist? TV. So let's watch a report from 1984 by CBN News.
The most popular comic book series right now is the X-Men. It's published by Marvel Comics, located in the building behind me here in downtown Manhattan. The X-Men are subhuman beings with supernatural powers bent on destroying evil. In this particular issue, God, Love, Man Kills. The X-Men, of course, are the heroes, the villain, a Christian evangelist. An evangelist felt he was called by God to destroy mutants like the X-Men, including the leader of the superheroes, whom he crucified, while quoting scripture, of course. In the end, the evangelist was shot, and the X-Men and their leader lived through the ordeal. Marvel Comics, which wouldn't grant CBN News an on-camera interview, called comics an important print media kids are very receptive to. However, they said when it comes to religion, they consider themselves neutral.
In this point, and if he looks up, he is not this evil incarnate, and then he says, in awe and wonder, he looks up to behold a man. Now, you recall the statement in the gospel, echo homo, behold the man, which had to do with Jesus. And here, there's a shaft of light, and he looks up to behold a man. They've taken scripture and twisted it totally with a crucifixion image and so forth. And here is the crucifixion going on of one of these subhumans, and out of this guy's chest is coming another person who we're not quite sure is he's hanging on a cross, and here he is bathed in light. You tell me that's not blasphemous, and not only, but this is being sold to your children.
Meanwhile, DC Comics' Greenberger, who says he feels most comics are spiritually uplifting, also told us a large number of the comic writers are, quote, very liberal and use the chance to poke fun at evangelicals who they feel are bending religious teachings the wrong way. The industry says it is selling the public what it wants. If this is what they want now, what could they possibly want in the future?
The comic books have changed dramatically, and I think what happens is we still have the concept of innocence in comic books that we had when we were growing up. For example, Spider-Man and Batman, Batman I grew up with, and Spider-Man is a relatively new hero.
This lady has got little or nothing on. There she is. So some 10-year-old's going to look at that picture and look at it, and that has an arousal tendency and start fantasizing on these women.
Now, sure, this is the Christian Broadcasting Network. This is the discourse of the religious right, so you might argue it's misleading to draw a comparison between this and the people complaining about the morality of leftist values in X-Men today, but as we touched on with entities like Bounding into Comics in that last video, Christian fundamentalism and waspy white nationalism still absolutely undergirds a lot of the anti-woke platforms and messaging we see online. Of course, nobody's saying God loves, man kills is woke today, but that's only because it isn't new, only because it was already canonical before the Gamergate Ghostbusters Last Jedi metastasis. It's the Ripley of X-Men stories, held as authentic, an example of it being done right, despite its villain being based on Reagan's Secretary of State because of that canonicity. Or rather, it's one of the Ripleys of X-Men stories, because again, commentary and progressivism abounds in this franchise, and practically always has. So if to be woke in this third wave sense, this co-opted sense, is understood not as displaying elements of progressivism controversial in the 2020s specifically, but as displaying elements of progressivism controversial for the time, if we reframe the discussion from this angle, asserting continuity here, reclaiming the X-Men as always woke in this sense too, becomes possible, becomes inevitable. If this is the framework of wokeness by which Morph is woke, the non-binary identity as today's morally suspect equivalent to the humanism and the emancipated costuming of God Loves Man Kills, then yes, this wokeness too is visible all throughout X history, and we can even see this further back. One popular image of comic books in the 60s is as a fantastical but lightweight medium, a time before the message overtook escapism. But the preserved reader correspondence and staff responses in Silver and Bronze Age comic back matter reveals this vision to be a rose-tinted one. One famous Stan Lee column from the editor's so-called soapbox makes explicit the company's progressive stance. And there is pushback even then to the ostensibly straightforward commentary on bigotry in books like X-Men's original run or, say, The Silver Surfer. In 1970, one of Lee's columns makes direct reference to reader correspondence accusing Marvel of putting moralizing above escapism, and Lee's response is clear. None of us live in a vacuum. Events shape Marvel's stories as they shape the lives of their staff and of their readers. It's clear that even this, the messaging of these books, the uncomplicated inclusive liberalism of Marvel's 60s, was controversial because we are looking at the controversy. The X-Men weren't always woke in this sense then, because issues or episodes of X-Media from previous decades included and affirmed precisely the same real-world identities X-Men 97 displays today, but because of the way it trended outspoken, the way its ethos was oriented towards difference and tolerance, and toward being ahead of the curve, in ways which, yes, have become less visible, but only because X-Men was right in predicting where the curve would be. If we're all still around in another 30 years or so, I wager nobody, not even that future's reactionaries, will view non-binary Morph as any less normal and non-controversial than things like Storm or God Loves, Man Kills or Marvel 60 seem today, because once again, society will have caught up with the X-Men. So to recap, with Morph, not much has changed. What little has changed has precedent both within the wider X franchise and within the animated series 97 universe. So if X-Men 97 is woke, that wokeness is nothing new, and someone might hold a position to the contrary, either if they're not clued in to the way X-Media has been aware of, sensitive to, reflective of inequalities, systemic problems, dynamics of otherness for nearly the past 60 years, or if they're defining woke in a descriptionist, presentist way, as determined by the presence of specifically today's, 2024's hot-button social issues and attributes, rather than as determined by issues and attributes progressive for the time, in which case, sure, it is now explicitly woke and was only implicitly woke before, but the same could be said for practically any new piece of media being released, and so being woke is even more meaningless a sentiment than it was before. Oh, or option 3, they don't actually believe it, and are holding that position solely for clicks. And that all covers a lot of the responses we've seen to 97 and its promotional material, but not quite all of them, because it's not all crosstalk, lack of knowledge, and terminological confusion. Some of the show's detractors, some of the X-Men went woke crowd, are not missing what the X-Men are and have been about, are misreading it, or are perhaps unable to perceive it thanks to fundamental ethical, ideological disagreements about what equality means and who deserves it. For an example of this, let's look back to the Blaze's article. See, it isn't just wrong about the history of the non-binary concept, it also applies its conclusions to the X-Men in an extremely wrong-headed manner. The Blaze quotes their contributor Lauren Chen, who of course has also worked for Turning Point USA, "It's all connected, her web connects them all," in saying, yes, the X-Men as a concept was built on the message of inclusion, but the idea of a non-binary character doesn't really fit into that, if you ask me, because the point of the X-Men is treat everyone the same regardless of their differences. But when it comes to non-binary people, it's more like they are the same as everybody else, but they want to be treated differently. The entire premise of a non-binary gender identity is actually trying to make something that is really essentially the same as everyone else into a different category, which is the opposite of the X-Men's messaging. Chen isn't reading here, she's projecting. What she's projecting doesn't make sense, and the place she's projecting that makes even less. The flaw in the idea that the correct thing to do is treat everyone identically regardless of their differences can be shown through a quick thought experiment. Imagine you're a teacher, you're taking your class on a trip, and you've got to provide them dinner. You book a venue and pre-order a healthy and filling meal for the whole class. It's balanced, it's got all your food groups, yada yada yada. On paper, this is a good meal, and it makes sense to choose choose this option at this restaurant. But then you remember, little Timmy's got celiac disease. The tiniest amount of gluten in his food will seriously wreck his health. And it doesn't matter if you've picked a dish without bread or pasta, because if the chefs even use the same equipment to prepare Timmy's chips as they did some previous guy's beer-battered fish, Timmy's still done for. You need to go to a place with proper celiac accreditation. But okay, sure, we can go there. Everyone can have the same dish there, and it's fine, right? But the only place in town that has that accreditation is the Thai place, and oh no, little Margaret has a peanut allergy. If there's so much as a stray peanut shaving in her dish, her throat's gonna swell up like Mrs. Puff.
Oh, SpongeBob, why?
You ring the place up and they say, apologies, but people come from miles around to try their pad thai. That's their most popular dish, so while it'd probably be fine, you could get a different dish and there shouldn't be any peanut traces in there, they can't guarantee that. So, one size doesn't always fit all. To treat everyone the same is to apply one approach to all, and to do this, you have to choose one approach and establish it as the norm. And the moment you do that, you're disadvantaging everyone for whom that approach isn't specifically tailored. Now, you can treat the whole class equally here, even Timmy, even Margaret, but you do that not by treating them identically, but by affording both the opportunity to eat something they can process, the same liberty you're affording to their gastrotypical classmates. You include them not by forcing them to fit the same mold as the norm set by your class's majority, but by being aware that their lived experience isn't the same in a way they didn't choose, and by making allowances for that. Maybe that means you have to go to two places, and maybe that's boring for the rest of the class. Maybe the rest of the class gets fed up. Maybe they feel like they're now at a disadvantage, like they've got it the worst, because they're only seeing this, the time they had to wait around one night, instead of seeing all the other nights Timmy and Margaret got sick or went hungry. When you're accustomed to privilege, here the privilege of your experience being the default, that disappearing, even for a moment, can feel like oppression. Lauren Chen thinks the message of the X-Men is that we should give all those school kids the same standard dinner, because that's her take, that's the bootstraps take, the traditional American take, the conservative take, the non-woke take, and she doesn't know much about the X-Men, but she knows that they are the good guys, so that must be it. But it isn't.
Charles Xavier entrusted me with his dream, and it does not ask you to love or embrace my kind as your own, but merely to accept that this is a shared world with a common future, and that my kind, like yours, have the right to live in it.
As X-Men 97, or older stories like God Loves, Man Kills, or any of the various Cure plots, either in the cartoon or the comics, or even the films, make clear, the point isn't that there isn't and ought not to be any difference between the mutant experience and the non-mutant one, the minority and the norm. The answer isn't that the X-Men should try not being mutants, it's that being mutants, being different but just as worthy, just as deserving of respect and empathy and equity, is an option. Because who said that normative modes of being are the true ones, should be the universal template anyway? Fawaz too reads the X-Men's affirming inclusive ethos as oriented more around heterogeneity than homogeneity, finding in the team's 70s space adventures in particular, affiliations based on shared social interests, rather than an assumed moral commitment to the category of the human. He later writes that X-Men under Claremont proposed an alternative to the seemingly all-inclusive sign of universal humanity in the form of a cross-species kinship network, more properly described as a queer mutanity, a network Fawaz suggests took shape through a distinctly feminist approach to forging alliances across difference, through visually dramatizing the intersectional nature of identity, and through the book's collective production of an evolving cognitive map of individual histories as they came into contact with broader collectives that included mutants, humans, and aliens of many stripes. So in a truly shocking turn of events, the Blaze contributor is wrong. The X mindset isn't that we're all the same really, that every identity is simply a variation on some God-given norm that we all need to orient ourselves around to the detriment of everything else. No, it's that people are different, but they all deserve dignity, respect, and the opportunity to coexist, and to coexist with those differences intact, without them being filed down to fit into society's norms.
We are different, but we shouldn't be trying to fit into society. Society should aspire to be more like us. Mutant, I'm proud.
The X-Men's message isn't give all those kids the same dinner, it's let's not let these kids go hungry. It's let's build a new restaurant where everyone can eat, and let's build another, and eventually a whole society where different people's dietary identities are on equal footing. Proper allergen protocols for everyone.
You know, I have plans for this place. I mean to turn it into a real campus, university, not just for mutants either, for humans too. Living and working, growing together.
And let's celebrate which new elements of cuisine present themselves.
All I've really done is create a world in which children can find peace and pride in being different.
Let's dispense of the overlong food metaphor. Any way you slice it, astronaut meme prevails. It is inevitable. Yes, the X-Men were always woke. Obviously, right? Did we teach you people nothing? Were you not watching? 90s show writer Julia Leewald said to Variety. Did we not figure out how to be nice to each other and how to get along? It's very odd to feel like we are still dealing with the same issues that we were dealing with 30 years ago. It's painful. On that, yeah, she and I agree. The past few weeks have been a bizarre time to be an X-Men fan online. The only thing more galling than seeing the post-Gamergate crypto-fash industrial complex churn out sloppy attempt after sloppy attempt at reframing this enduring cultural beacon of progressivism as the latest thing to be destroyed by wokeness has been seeing that messaging embraced uncritically by so many. But it has also been an encouraging time to be an X-Men fan, because guess what? The revival is good, and the revival gets it. We see in moments like that clip I just played that, unlike some, this show is crystal clear on what the ethos of this team is. We see their goal, and we see their problems. Institutions like hospitals refusing service, the way shared problems aren't shared equally when marginalization intersects with privilege, and shit, you guys, I think I've had the executioner in my comments section before.
Know what I hate about your kind? You act like you got it so bad. Normal people have it hard too. We just have the dignity not to whine about it.
Sure, okay, maybe some of that is a little on the nose, but there are layers here too. Cyclops' goal of de-escalation with the protesters, or the complexities of Storm and Jean's mutant sisterhood. And guess what? 4 decades ago, Claremont opened a story with 2 little African-American mutants getting lynched by a hate mob. Tell me why that's different, how it doesn't count, that it was subtle. Please, go on, make a fool of yourself. But most of those guys aren't gonna, right? They're already moving on. Notice the way almost all of the anti-woke rabble-rousers have quietly stopped talking about the show since it actually started airing, since it became clear that people liked it and its approach. The benefit of pre-release woke spotting like this is that you can clam up or pivot when the thing releases if it becomes clear you read the room wrong, that it'll just be another one of those increasingly numerous counterexamples to the get woke, go broke mantra. You can even skew positive after the fact, change some old video titles, and pray Hesto, you were just being cautiously optimistic this whole time. Again, we've covered this. They're abandoning ship. You don't have to defend your position if you just move on to the next battle. Since I started work on this video, this lot switched to trying to make Gamergate 2 happen, based on willful ignorance to what the phrase narrative consultancy means. And now I hear they're onto the Acolyte too, because people don't understand the concept of unreliable narrators, so they can claim a trailer is canon-breaking, shows Disney killing Star Wars for what, like the 6th time at this point? And the uncomfortable truth behind all this, the thing I've been blocking my ears to over the, again, weeks I've spent on this video, is that counter-argument, educational, debunk, whatever you want to call them, videos like this can't be the thing that defeats these channels, these websites, and their reign of misinformative propaganda, because the time it takes to properly refute something is orders of magnitude greater than the time it takes to make narrative peddling nonsense up. Like Mark Twain said, falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it. Except that wasn't Mark Twain, that was Jonathan Swift, but do you see the way you just believed me? The way that even the 3% of you that felt a little doubt over that quote's attribution would have had to pause the video, rewind, type the quote into Google, and check the source for something so simple as a direct quote? Now scale that up to the sort of vague nonsense that drives this culture war and you'll see the problem. I've just taken a month or so to try and set the X record straight, and in that time, the people moaning about its misalignment have made their play, farmed their outrage, and moved on to greener pastures. Even if any of them end up seeing this video, they won't give it a second thought. And let's be honest with ourselves, this probably hasn't convinced a great number of those viewers either. Mental goalposts will have simply moved. So this video isn't the answer. It's not a silver bullet for the culture war, it can't be. But it's not nothing either, and I think it is still worthwhile, because in amidst all this murkiness, these moving goalposts, the treachery of terminology, meaning does still exist. The X-Men were always woke. I have shown that. You have seen that. And that has to be worth something, right? Thanks for making it through. This was a long one. Oh, and please don't comment below telling me I forgot to mention one particular historical instance of the X-Men being woke. I know I've left some out, but that was always a given, since there are so many examples. Or, you know, I don't mind. Engagement's engagement. If you're interested in pursuing this topic further, make sure you've seen my other 2 related videos. There's a brief elaboration on part 2, maybe coming soon. I also pop up in a video actual fandom's making on this topic, which will probably be out before this one is, but above all, I recommend checking out the books I've quoted from in this video, Douglas Wolk's All of the Marvels and Ramzi Fawaz' The New Mutants. The former is a lighter read, the latter's a weightier one. It is really good though. Also, just read more old X-Men comics, it's all there. On a more selfish note, if you did like this video, please do consider helping to support the channel either on Patreon or with a YouTube membership. I've tried to go deep this month and really settle this X-Men issue, but YouTube likes quantity over quality, and that is reflected in the AdSense payouts. Ultimately, beefing up those financial support systems is the only way I'll be able to keep making stuff like this long term. So yeah, a giant-sized thank you to everyone you're seeing on screen now, the people supporting me already. My mutant power is being extremely grateful for all this faith, and shout out especially to Hanan, Daniel Goldhorn, Karen Kuhlman, Magath, Ryan Emily, Something Capitalism Bad, Thomas R, and Weirdy Beardy. Thanks for watching, and don't go anywhere.